What's going on, guys? Jim Surratt, Hammer Strength Conditioning, coming at you today. I want to talk very briefly about how to apply the conjugate method to tactical strength and conditioning, right? So the conjugate method, developed and popularized by Louis Simmons of Westside Barbell, applied to powerlifting primarily, but not exclusive to powerlifting, right? A lot of the tenets, the edicts, the principles, the concepts of the conjugate method can be applied to really any sort of performance, whether sport, tactical, sort of regardless or irrespective of profession, it can be applied, right? So today what we're going to do is just a crash course in how to take the concepts of the conjugate method and apply them to tactical strength and conditioning, right? So very quick, very brief, very sort of surface level. If you have questions about this, please feel free to DM me, shoot me a message, an email, whatever, and we can talk about it more, okay? So there's 3 sub-methods within the conjugate method. Okay, and I think that car analogies are really useful to help develop understanding of these principles, right? I'm not a car guy, I'm not a gearhead, or a grease monkey or anything like that, right? But I think that the car analogies and the car similes or metaphors are very universally understood, and they're very appropriate. So, max effort method. This is where you get strong, right? So this is your horsepower, okay? This is how much force you're able to produce, how much weight you're able to lift, how much resistance you're able to push, okay? Dynamic effort. This would be your rate of force development, so how quickly you can develop that force, how fast you go from point A to point B, right? This is your acceleration, okay? And then finally, you have your repetition effort method, which is your accessory movements, which is where we develop hypertrophy, connective tissue durability, that kind of stuff, resilience, endurance, work capacity, that kind of stuff. These would be like the accessories on the car, so like your tires, your wheels, your brakes, your struts, all that kind of stuff, right? Everything that helps the car perform outside of the engine and the transmission, right? And then finally, we have energy system development, or ESD for short, which is straight up your engine, right? How much power you can produce, like how much gas you have in the tank, right? So either your engine or your gas tank, right? So max effort. So traditionally within the conjugate method, we do 1 rep maxes, right? You'll sometimes see anywhere from like a 2 to a 5 rep max, which is not true max effort. It may be a max effort double or a max effort triple or so forth and so on, right? But it is not true maximal effort because it is a repeated effort. It's a high intensity repetition effort, right? But it is not true max effort. A true maximal effort exertion is a singular exertion of force into a resistance, right? Into resistance, right? Into an opposing force, right? So if I'm squatting a 1 rep max to a box squat, that's my 1 rep max. That is max effort, right? A 2, 3, 4, or 5 rep max is still like maximum effort or high intensity effort, but it's not true max effort, right? So typically when I program for whether it's athletes, powerlifters, or tactical populations, I always program 1 rep maxes, right? Because there's a theory or a principle that basically argues that as you get deeper into a high intensity set, your ability to produce force and maintain integrity through your posture, your positioning, your technique decreases, right? As fatigue accumulates, performance decreases, right? Pretty simple formula, right? Inputs and outputs. And I have found that with most either athletes or tactical professionals, they lack the requisite skill to maintain appropriate posture, position, and technique under maximal load without incurring injury, right? So the whole premise of behind strength conditioning is to mitigate the likelihood of incurring an injury, right? Whether through contact, combat, stress, repeated exposure, that kind of stuff, right? We're trying to avoid all that kind of stuff. So why would I put an athlete in a position where they're more likely or most likely to incur an injury under my supervision, under my purview? Not going to happen, right? So 1 rep maxes is the way to go. 1 rep maxes are completely safe as long as you are proficient enough to execute them. If you are not, okay, then we can start using like the repetition effort method to build proficiency in our skill execution, and then we can take the skill we learn, the skill acquisition here with the repetition effort method, and apply it eventually to the max effort method, right? But don't anybody tell you that 1 rep maxes aren't safe, because they absolutely are as long as you are skilled enough to do it. Riding a bike is dangerous, right? If you don't know how to do it. Driving a car, terribly dangerous if you don't know how to do it. You can kill people. 1 rep maxes, totally safe. Okay? So some example movements that I would use for tactical populations. Box squat, wide stance, Box squat is really easy to teach. It's easy to execute. You can adjust for depth based on ability, proficiency, mobility, flexibility, all the abilities, right? Standardized, okay. Pretty easy to learn, pretty easy to execute. Sumo deadlift, much more low back friendly as compared to conventional deadlift, even a trap bar deadlift. And again, builds the hip flexors, the groin, the adductors, the glutes, and I'm not a huge fan of like sport specific training, like mimicking positions or patterns found in sport or found in profession. But I think there's some value to it, it's just limited. But like, if you're gonna pick somebody or something up, right, you're not gonna approach it with a close conventional stance and like bend over and like hump it up, right? You're gonna take that sumo stance. You can't see, but I'm in a sumo stance right now. You're gonna do that sumo stance, you're gonna squat down, pick it up, and use your base of support to generate power to stand up, right? So it has some specificity of application, I think. But again, not a huge fan of it, but much more in favor of the sumo deadlift for tactical professionals as compared to the conventional deadlift, right? A lot of tactical professionals have lower back issues, knee issues, that kind of stuff. So if we can stay away from those things and continue to make progress, why not do it, right? Zercher squat, I think is a highly effective tool. I like to use axles, saves the elbows, really works on like upper back, core engagement, posterior delt strength, bicep strength, all that kind of stuff, right? All the things that might be appropriate for tactical populations. And then finally, as far as pressing, board and or floor presses. I'm not against full range of motion bench press for tactical populations. It just depends what their elbows and their shoulders and their upper back and their technique look like, right? A lot of tactical professionals, especially military, have jacked up shoulders, right? From rucking all the time. So they're like this, you got the ruck palsy, right? So if we can avoid, again, irritating or agitating things and still make progress by either a limited range of motion with the board or a floor press, why not do it, right? Because powerlifting is squat, bench, and deadlift, right? So as a competitive powerlifter, that is your sport, and those are the things which you have to train, right? So you train to get better at those particular things, okay? With tactical strength and conditioning, especially with the Conjugate Method, you are just using those as tools to help improve performance, right? So they're generalized tools being applied for a specific outcome, right? So I don't care how much my guys bench, I don't care how much my guys squat or deadlift. If they can't deadlift, we find another way around it. If we can't squat, we find another way around it. If we can't bench, guess what? We find another way around it, right? So as a tactical strength and conditioning professional, you can't be married to any one sort of modality, right? You have to be able to and willing to adapt and adjust on the fly based on the circumstances with which you are presented. Okay, so we talked about the 2 to 5 rep maxes. That's this XRM. So used as appropriate based on skill and proficiency. Every once in a while, I think it's good to like go hit a heavy double or heavy triple for some strength endurance. But if we're looking at things from a true max effort, maximal strength, like true maximal strength perspective, 1 rep max is the way to go. Okay. I use RPE. I don't like percentages for my max effort work because, especially with tactical populations, work schedules can be so fluid and dynamic and fluctuating, and they can be really long days and long nights and very stressful, both emotionally, mentally, and physically, right? So if you prescribe a certain percentage for a population or for an individual after a long shift or a long day at work, whatever it may be, a stressful shift, that percentage is going to get shifted to the right, up and to the right, so it's going to get more intense, right? So if you prescribe a 95% effort single, that 95% effort single might turn into 105% effort single, right? So you're overtraining, you're increasing the risk of incurring injury, that kind of stuff, right? So if you use RPE, especially on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a subjective measure, right? So you can say, hey, we're going to hit an RPE of 9 today, or we're going to go full bore and hit a 10. But the good news is that because it's a subjective scale, it allows the lifter or the athlete or the professional to adjust the weight without adjusting the intensity, right? So if normally 405, sorry, I'm burping, I can't stop. So if normally 405 is my RPE 10, right? But I had a long shift or I had a really stressful shift, maybe 365 is my RPE 10, right? I'm still getting the relative or the respective level of intensity. I'm just not overtraining and overshooting by virtue of the weight that's on the barbell, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, so that's max effort. Super important for tactical populations because max effort, maximal strength then yields, as your strength threshold, as your strength ceiling increases, gets higher, your submaximal ability also increases, right? So think about the 225 rep test. If I bench 450 pounds, right, 225 pounds is 50% of that, right? So it's a lot easier to move 50% than it is to move 75%. If my bench is 315, 225 might be like that 70 to 75% range. So it's a lot easier to move a lighter submaximal weight than it is a heavier submaximal weight for repetition, for repeated effort, right? Which will then allow you to continue to develop your submaximal strength, which will then drive your maximal strength, right? So it all sort of ties into itself and into each other, okay? Dynamic effort. So this is, again, your rate of force development, so how quickly you can accelerate. I think for tactical populations, there should be a heavy emphasis on dynamic effort lower. So squat and deadlift. Again, box squat, sumo deadlift. You can vary those things up, and you should vary those things up, but I think that should be your bread and butter, either against bands or against chain, because we're looking at rate of force development, we're not looking at force production, right? We want to see how fast we can move the bar, not how much weight we can move, right? So different. Max effort is how much weight can we move and how fast can we move it, right? But the dynamic effort method supports the max effort method. Okay, so it all ties into each other, into itself, right? So emphasis on dynamic effort lower. I'm not a huge fan of dynamic effort upper for tactical populations, at least not in the classical conjugate sense or the classical West Side sense of like speed bench. I don't think it really has any carryover or application to the profession or to the population. And you can get away, you can not get away with, but you can get around not using dynamic effort upper by doing things like throws, okay, or like a med ball floor press, laying on your back, like producing as much force as possible, right? Standing throws, vertical throws, all that kind of stuff, right? So things that might have more functional application as compared to like a dynamic effort bench press. You can do dynamic effort bench press, absolutely. There's nothing saying you can't. It's just something that I tend to stay away from or gravitate away from. I guess you don't gravitate away from things, diverge from. Just because I don't really feel it has a whole lot of application, right? There's other ways to train that rate of force development that are more appropriate to the population, okay? So this is where you use percentages. So you use 50, 55, and 60% of your 1 rep max across a 3-week wave. So it's as Louis always used to say, it's a 3-week pendulum wave, right? So 50, 55, 60, and you start back over at 50, 55, and 60, and then you rotate bands and chains and movements, that kind of stuff, right? So you can get fancy with it. You can include like sacred squat bars, front squats, trap bar deadlifts, rack pulls. You can do all kinds of stuff you want, right? There's no rule saying you can't do anything. It just depends on what your population is capable of, how much time you have, and the goals you're trying to execute, okay? But I think jumps and throws are super important for the tactical populations. Again, if you look at it from just a performance-based perspective, like a tactical professional should be able to jump. Vertical, broad, over things, from different positions. Like one of my favorite progressions for jumping, like for a box jump, is standing box jump to, and this is over time, right? This isn't like all in the same session, right? So standing box jump, weighted med ball box jump, seated box jump, and then seated weighted, so like seated med ball box jump, right? And then if you want to get super fancy, you can do like kneeling jump, and then kneeling jump to broad jump, kneeling jump to vertical jump, right? So you can start applying different layers to these jumps, right? This comes down to, again, what your population is capable of and the goals that you're trying to achieve. Okay, but all your athletes, regardless of sport or tactical, should be jumping and throwing and sprinting, right? Sprint, jump, throw, right? Important stuff. Repetition effort. This is your accessories. So again, this is all the stuff that makes the car function, right? So this is your engine, this is your transmission maybe, this is your gas tank, ESD is your gas tank, this would be like, again, your struts, your brakes, your wheels, steering column, all that kind of stuff, right? Everything puts the car together makes a car, right? So accessories emphasizing hypertrophy and durability, right? So muscle is armor, right? As tactical professionals, the more muscle you have, functional muscle, right? We don't need bodybuilders, right? Not to say that bodybuilders can be functional, right? But the point I'm trying to make is that you want functional hypertrophy, right? So just like if I'm training like a cross-country runner, I want to improve the muscularity and the hypertrophy of their lower limbs, like their hamstrings, their quadriceps, their glutes, their hip flexors, their adductors, without making them heavy, right? Because obviously it takes more energy or more force to move more mass across a distance, right? So we want functional hypertrophy, right? And that's sort of a term that I use loosely. Functional is an open term, but we want a larger muscle is typically, traditionally, classically, a stronger muscle. Not always, right? It's not a one-to-one correlation, right? But typically, the bigger a muscle is, the larger cross-sectional area it has, the more force it can produce, right? And then it comes down to which muscle type you have, which fiber type you have, that kind of stuff. But we're not going to get into that because I'm out of breath. But a bigger muscle usually produces more force and is more effective at absorbing force, right? So if we're looking at things from like a internal organ perspective, protection perspective, the more muscle you have, the more protected your system is potentially, right? And then the bigger, stronger, more durable a muscle is, and the connective tissue, right, the less likely you are to incur either contact or non-contact soft tissue injury, right? I'm a big fan of selecting accessory exercises that have a high return on investment, right? So big ROI. So your presses, your rows, your single leg movements, your posterior chain movements. I'm a huge proponent of high volume band work, right? So like especially for connective tissue. So, and for durability, local muscular endurance, that kind of stuff, right? So there's a few things that I use, right? So like band triceps, okay? I have my people do 100 triceps a couple times a week, right? You can do more if you wanted to, right? Louis used to talk about like doing band triceps for 100 reps, three to 5 times a week, right? On your off days, you can do them every single day, right? Band hamstring curls, both seated and prone, to hit the hamstrings and the connective tissue in different angles, right? Different angles in different ways. Band good mornings, band face pulls, band pull aparts, all this stuff, right? There's a bunch of stuff you can do with band work. I'm a huge proponent of high volume band work because each repetition is relatively low intensity, right? So like one band pull apart is not the same as one 100-pound dumbbell row, right? So you need higher volume to elicit a similar response, right? But the good news is that volume, that aggregate or accumulated volume, is relatively low intensity, right? So again, because one band pull apart does not equal one row, 1-to-1, right? You can do a bunch of these, way more than these, right? And you're eliciting a different stimulus and different response, right? Different adaptation. But they both have their place, right? So again, 100 band pull aparts, 100 band triceps, 100 band face pulls, 100 leg curls, 100 good mornings, that kind of stuff, right? And you get it multiple times a week, and you start developing durability and endurance, like local muscular endurance or local connective tissue endurance, local tissue endurance, I guess you could just call it, through the soft tissues. You start, I think, driving, probably in a small effect or a small way, you start driving skeletal adaptation as well, just by virtue of continued exposure to stimulus. Hypertrophy, osteohypertrophy, I don't know, just making shit up now. But anyway, so pick stuff that's going to give you the most bang for your buck, and it doesn't waste your time. You can always throw in if you got a bunch of operators who are like, yo bro, I like my big biceps. Do bicep curls, right? There's not the bicep is a functional muscle. I think it gets a bad rap as a decorative muscle, but it absolutely has function, right? A pull up, a row, a curl, right? You're gonna do all those things out in the field, right? So why not be strong in those positions, right? Now, we don't often think about training biceps for the sake of improving our curl or our pull-up or our row strength, right? We tend to think about the back for that. But why not do it, right? And especially like, you know, if you as the coach want X done, but the athletes want Y done, meet somewhere, or they want Z done, meet somewhere in the middle at Y, so that you both get the effect that you want, right? Repetition effort method can also be used for GPP, general physical preparedness. I'm a huge proponent of carries, pushing and pulling, so like sled drag or sled pushes, or wheelbarrow carries, sandbag carries, axle carries, safety squat bar walks, all that kind of stuff, right? Bunch of different ways you get that done. Really limited by your imagination, your equipment, and by your population skill set, okay? And your time. And then finally, my nemesis, energy system development. So all of this, repetition or max dynamic and repetition effort, this is all general, right? This is all general prep. ESD is specific prep, right? So this is where you start getting specific with your training, right? So when I was working with first group, like if I had a mountain team, I knew they needed to be in better shape potentially, like aerobically, than maybe like a free fall team or halo team, right? Doesn't mean that halo team doesn't need to be in shape, but by virtue of what this mountain team is doing as compared to the halo team, right, there's different requirements, different expectations, different demands on the system, right? So this is where you can start getting specific, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of specificity, right, because it's contextual and situational, right? So again, task, mission, or duty specific. What is the skill set you need to develop? What is the mission set that you have? What are the demands of that mission set? And then how do you go about training for that, right? Fortunately, you know enough of that far enough out. Not always, right? But very rarely does somebody just get a mission dropped on them, right? And that's the good thing about being an operator, about being a tactical professional, is that you try to stay ready year round, right? So that when you have those moments of execution, it's not it's a, oh, now I'm ready. Can I just go about doing my job? Okay. So that is the utilization and application and adaptation of the conjugate method for tactical populations in a nutshell. Hopefully you learned something from this. Please feel free to DM me, either on my personal at Jimberjacked or HammerSNC. Email me hammersnc@gmail.com or visit my website www.hammersnc.com. Cool? That's it. Thanks for checking out. As always, don't waste pain.